joining us. Thank you for gifting us with your time. Um, Perhaps you can just say hello to everybody, Neil, and tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll dive into the conversation.
Thank you, Crispin. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here. And thank you to all the guests that are joining us as well. So just a little bit about myself. In the context of the topic today, I've been fortunate to have had the opportunity to work in various industries across the country, both as a on a full-time basis and as a management consultant, although the overwhelming majority of the time I've spent in management consulting. I've worked in industries ranging from retail, financial services, bioscience, public sector, oil and gas, motor industry, among others. So I've been very fortunate in my exposure. Most of my work has been in towns, and then a lot of the time also in Johannesburg and Pretoria and the Eastern Cape and a couple of towns within the East London region. So yeah, as I said, most of the time I've spent in management consulting, but the last 5 years I've spent fulfilled the role of MD in a small private company, which was extremely rewarding. In fact, it was both rewarding and daunting at the same time. It was completely new to me in terms of size and the industry itself. But fortunately, I worked with wonderful people. It was myself and another director. We worked very well together, which made the experience so much more enjoyable and rewarding. So yeah, now I'm back into the consulting space with Boundless Wisdom, and I am excited to be here.
Super. Thank you, Neil, and welcome on board, and super excited to have you as part of the family. Our topic, Neil, around transition, personal and professional. I was playing around a bit and landed on 3 definitions, if I may, just to start off with. And the first was, it's a change from one form or type to another. So there's this concept of change in shape and form and substance. The other one that resonated with me is pivotal moments that influence or shapes us. And then the third one that I really appreciated is the concept of transformative experiences. And the word that connected all 3 of those concepts for me is process. That there's, in all of this, there's a process. And reflecting on that earlier today, it was about 2 years ago, I transitioned, if you want, from a father of 2 really incredible, talented young men to being the grandfather of 2 even more talented and beautiful young grandchildren. And it was just a kind of automatic process. But thinking of the process part of it, I realized today that, there was a shift in mind, there was a shift in heart, there was a shift in priority. There was a shift too in the nature of relationship. So where I would have a conversation with one of my sons as dad, son, it's now father to a son who's also now a father. And so it's just fascinating thinking about, if we think about transitions, the process part of it and how it connects our experiences. And using that as a segue, if you could just share with us some of your transformative experiences, please, in your consulting career, in your professional career, in your personal life. What have been some of those really transformative experiences? And then on the back of that, Neil, the process part, how have you navigated through that? How have you transitioned from one form or type into another? What have been some of the lessons learned, some of the mistakes potentially made? And if you had to do some of that over again, how would you go about that? I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but I'd just like to get your real lived experience on this, please.
Okay. Thanks, Crispin. You are throwing a lot at me. But let's start in the beginning. I mean, the old adage that says the only constant is change certainly
Mm.
for all of us. It doesn't matter where we find ourselves. And I think it's just been exponentially sped up over the last 5, maybe to 7 years. And so for me, and in line with those definitions that you mentioned, for me, transition is really, how do I deal with the changes happening in my environment?
Mm-hmm.
Because for me, the transition is not in the environment, but it's what happens inside, what is happening to Neil. In your
Mm.
example, how do you relate to your
Mm.
son now as being your son, but also as a new father?
Mm. Mm.
So, so having said that, and I think you've captured some of it, um, it's really around how I adapt to the changes in my environment, both personal and professional, from a physical, emotional, and psychological perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of it is subconscious. It's based on how we've grown up, all the influences we've had in the past, and who we are today. But for me, in the context of today's discussion, the critical question is always, what does the change and therefore the transformation mean for me in
Mm-hmm.
terms of how I show up as a leader, as a person
Okay.
within any organization, whether it be a community organization, in the workplace, friend group, family, etc., etc., because they are all organizations in any
Mm-hmm.
case. And then, yeah, so how do I show up as a leader? And more importantly, how do I show up as the leader I want to become? What type of
Mm-hmm.
leader do I want to be? So, in the professional perspective, from the professional perspective, I mean, probably the most drastic change I've made, too, I'm going to mention two, was earlier on in my career where I changed from being working in the public sector and then moving, and that's at the end of the last millennium. So it's a long time ago. But it was a huge change for me moving into the private sector when I joined one of the larger, or actually one of the largest professional services firms in the world. Um, what assisted me there was actually the support system that I had around me at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And more uh, on a deeper level, the spiritual upbringing that I had as a child growing up, uh, basically also guiding me in that from that perspective. And there was a lot of introspection that needed to happen in terms of just making sure that I'm doing the right thing. Are you really prepared to take the risk? So from a process perspective, it was acknowledging that a transition is upon me,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and then also then marrying that with who do I want to be? Where do I want to be? How do I want to show up in the world? And how does this transition, how is that going to assist me, number one, uh, in achieving that or being that? And secondly, how does that transition impact on the roles that I have now? So, but it's a conscious decision that one needs to make in terms of identifying, then marrying that with who I am and who I'd like to be, and then doing the internal work in terms of uh, the emotional and psychological processes that you have to go through, because it's a huge change. For me, it was a huge change at the time. And I think for me, the support system that I have really assisted me, having somebody to talk to that understands that kind of transition was really a blessing, if I'm honest with you. Yeah,
Neil, sorry, may I pause there and just come back to a couple of things you said, if you're okay with that,
that's fine.
please. I'm hearing you saying that in any transition, there's always risk. we don't
That's
always know how it's going to pan out. And some of us are obviously more risk averse than others, and some of us would embrace it and go along, and others would probably want to play it safer. So that's the one thing I'm hearing you say. But what I'm hearing you also saying, just, and I'd like to unpack that, please, is in the example you've mentioned about, am I doing the right thing? What I'm hearing you also say is that the transition, the change you mentioned from the public sector into the private sector is not something that happened to you. It's something you were using to get to a sense of who you really are as a person. You were using it rather than it was happening to you. You get the distinction I'm trying to make, that sometimes
right.
these things happen to us, and they may erode us of who we are or strip of our identity. And what I'm hearing you saying is exactly the opposite, is I'm using this transition as a vehicle for growth and who I really am and who I want to be as a leader and as a person. Have I got that right?
You've got that right, Crispin. That does the fact that it was a conscious choice doesn't make it less daunting, though.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
moving into an unknown environment, a completely different industry, different people. So yes, you've captured it. It doesn't make it less daunting. But yeah. And then the other example that was
Mm-hmm.
quite profound in my life, and it's much more recent, was when I moved. And all the organizations I've worked with, both in the public sector and the private sector, have been huge organizations within the financial services sector, within the professional services firm in the public sector, and also one of the uh, higher education institutions. They were huge organizations. And then I moved into a smaller organization. And I was shocked at the depth of the transition that I had to make within
Mm-hmm.
myself. And the reason for that was it was my first exposure to a small business. And as I said earlier on, I was quite fortunate in having another director with me who was quite supportive,
Mm-hmm.
who supported everything that we wanted to achieve, and we've achieved quite a lot. But the luxury that we had, that I was used to in a huge organization, and I'm talking about resource abundance here, um,
Mm-hmm.
wasn't there. And that's just the reality in small businesses. So it really took a concerted effort to transition. Yeah, the word is transition, to actually embracing that this is the reality. And when I talk about resource abundance, and I'm talking about human capital, there wasn't, there isn't, there isn't room for any fat in a small business. And that's the reality. So I take my hat off to people who run small businesses and
Mm-hmm.
entrepreneurs who venture down that path, because it's not an easy road. It's a personal journey more than a career journey. There's nobody to pick up the phone to say, hey, listen, I've got these challenges. How do I deal with it? Who can help me? There's no huge marketing department. There's no huge HR department. The reality is, in a small business, it all stops with you. And when I say
Mm-hmm.
you, I'm talking about myself as the MD and my fellow director, whom I worked with quite nicely. We shared an office, which I'm not sure was a good thing because we were quite close in proximity. Uh, but it also meant that we had a shared experience, both physically and in terms of running the business.
Mm-hmm.
So the big transition was, it's a lean organization. There's not a lot of room for playing around. And when we develop or decide on particular actions, when you look around, there's nobody, because it's people are busy, there's no fat, and it really ends up with the two of us. And we used to joke and say, you know what, we were quite spoilt, where we were before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The other thing that I really needed to get used to, Crispin, which was for me a personal transition, was that I didn't experience for myself, or I didn't make the time for deep work. In other words, I didn't make the time or have the time for anything else but what needed to happen within the business, both from an operational perspective and in a management perspective. You know, if one individual doesn't show up for work for whatever reason, it doesn't happen often, but when it does happen, it's a huge gaping hole. And so you've got to change schedules, you've got to approach people and basically not disturb people, but you have to rearrange the operational processes. And sometimes, quite often, it happens that you need to do that, you know. And so between the two of us and other staff members, we spent long hours at work, just busy grafting, you know, because there is no other way of keeping the business running and achieving our strategic objectives. But having said all of that, I did say to you it was rewarding. And when I say we, I'm talking about the people that I worked with. We've achieved quite a lot in terms of where the business is now. If I remember correctly, it's been a while ago since I looked at the numbers. We've achieved a 30% compounded annual growth rate. Wow. And that's testimony to the people that work there and the efforts of everybody that goes in there. One thing that was great was that because I had spent so much time in the consulting space, and my fellow director was a technical person. She has technical skills. We worked quite well together in terms of crafting standardized and documented business processes just to assist us and assist staff in terms of moving forward with the organization, and then in an attempt to free us from operational responsibility. So that was huge. I had to dig very, very deep in order to not get frustrated at times. But with the right support system and great people that you work with, it does help you. So that's what I said earlier on. If you have good people around you that can support you, and that is able to listen and debate in a mature manner, it does help. By no means did we agree on everything. We had some serious disagreements, etc. And
Neil?
That's one of the things that I've learned in that experience is don't be attached to the outcome necessarily. Keep an open mind. Focus on the bigger picture. And, move more towards the relational leadership than the transactional leadership. Yeah, that was a big lesson for me, and it was a big transition as well.
Let's just work with that, please. I want to connect three words that you used. You'll recall a colleague of ours talks about this transition, and there's this thing called the messy middle. In the middle of all of this, there's a lot of messiness, is what I'm hearing you also say now. You spoke earlier about internal work that needed to be done. You mentioned now that you recognize that you didn't do enough of what you called the deep work. And at one point you mentioned that what was important for you as you were navigating transitions in your life was your spiritual upbringing. Just connect deep work, internal work, and that for me. What does it mean? What does deep work entail? How did you do that? What was important for you as you were thinking about that? And if you had to just pivot that into some real practical suggestions, tips, advice around what does that deep work really actually entail?
So when
for
I
you, what was that, and how did you do that?
Yes. So I separate deep work from internal work. So let's start with deep work. Deep
Okay,
work for me is much more of the on a functional level. When you block out your
okay,
diary for the morning and you say, I actually want to do some research. I actually want to know a little bit more about a particular aspect of
okay,
business
okay.
and the market and our competitors, etc., etc. So that's in terms of deep work, and I think it's vitally important because you can easily, well, I did uh, in the beginning lose sight of the ecosystem in which I was
Ah,
operating. You with
mm,
me? So
mm,
you're just grinding, grinding. When you look again,
mm,
3 years have gone, and you've just been busy.
mm,
When I
mm,
talk about the inner work, I'm talking about understanding your a little bit about your psychology in terms of what motivates me, Neil van der Scholtz. Is it acknowledgement? Is it achievement and recognition? Is it connection, etc., etc.? And then within that, also then understanding the rest of your team members. What motivates your team members? Once you understand, once I understand myself, once I understood myself and what triggers me, it just becomes easier to manage both myself, but also the team that I'm leading. So the inner work was really around understanding, getting us, making sure that I understand myself, a heightened degree of self-awareness, not self-importance, self-awareness in
mm,
terms
mm,
of my personality, in terms of my psychology, because as we know, most of our reactions, most of our actions are from our subconscious in any case. So at least the awareness thereof allowed me to be much more conscious in terms of just showing up and try and working towards the leader that I want to be. So
mm,
that's
mm.
the inner work.
I like that distinction. It makes sense, and I can understand how we. And isn't that where most of us, where we find ourselves, where most leaders find themselves? This craziness of what we're in, the pressure we're all under to deliver and to perform, the the deadlines we're under, the almost disruptive nature of the ecosystem we are finding ourselves in and leading in, that we don't get to both the deep work and the inner work, um, and we kind of get stuck in this messy middle all the time, and struggle maybe to free ourselves from that. Consciously, Neil, what did you practice? What did you do? Were there certain rituals, habits, engagements, conversations you had around the inner work that worked for you, and served you during those times of transition?
Yeah, certainly I'm going to share just a few with you. But for me, the most important was making time for reflection. And
Mm-hmm,
that's in my own space, when I'm in my own space, in my own time. So making time for reflection and making time for the things that I love. I love nature.
mm-hmm,
So I would get on my bike. We have 150 kilometers of dirt track on the farms around the corner, or along the contours of the mountain. So that was really therapeutic for me. I really enjoyed that. It just allowed me to just escape, but also to be by myself. I also find that making time for the important people in your life, so spending time with them, whether it be my daughters or my partner at the time, or my brothers and sisters, or my friends, that was quite important to me. Making time to spend with people that are close to me. And then I think having somebody, I always have somebody that I can
mm-hmm,
reflect what I'm experiencing.
mm-hmm,
So it's not somebody that comes with solutions, it's somebody that listens. It's a dear friend of mine. and literally holds a mirror,
mm, mm,
because it allows me to engage in a neutral, well, not a neutral, but with somebody else, uh, to discuss and clarify what I'm thinking. Why am I feeling like this? Etc., etc.
mm,
So
mm,
that has worked for me. I have found, Crispin, that if I'm not physically fit, I don't deal well with transition. I
that's interesting. Mm,
It is interesting because as I was growing up, I've always been very busy with sport and playing, etc. And that went well into my young adult life. Um, so I do make time to be physically active so that I can keep my body at a reasonable level of fitness,
mm,
so
mm.
that I don't get into the rut of not being able to deal well with transitions. And that has helped me quite a lot. I must
Mm.
say that I do find for myself, physicality does assist me in dealing with stressful situations and gives me clarity as well.
So I'm hearing meaningful connection with family, friends, loved ones as important. I'm hearing the access to a thinking buddy or a wisdom guide, we call it, or somebody
Mm.
that's actually just neutrally there to listen, to hear, and to hold up the mirror, as you were saying. I'm hearing something too about the importance of routine and being intentional about routine in what you're saying. And then the last point you mentioned, I think we take that for granted, I believe, and we don't really do enough in that space. Or I don't, is physicality, being looking after ourselves physically, and exercising and that. If you had to reflect on lessons learned, Neil, and I mean you're mentioning two major transitions, and imagine there are many more in your life, but the two that you sharing with us, um, lessons learned, mistakes made, um, one or two things you probably would do differently. If you think about where you are now, and we both are in a transition where we are now in our professional worlds and in our personal lives and these things. Just some lessons learned, mistakes made, things you would potentially do differently.
Yeah, certainly. You know, as a management consultant, we just literally we spend our days between different clients. So we almost instinctively make a switch between a client. I'm using examples now from a financial services where there's a
Mm,
particular hierarchy and culture and structure. And there's also a certain pace that's
mm,
associated with that. And then you spend that with time with them in the morning, in the afternoon, you go to a retailer where the pace is completely different. It's 10x, and the organization is flat. Decisions must be made extremely fast. There's no time for collegial consensus, and they work with everything from the recipe of a soup right through to buying another business. So there's just a lot of agility and flexibility. And as a professional consultant, I need to be cognizant of it. So you take it almost for granted.
mm,
You're task focused and you're working.
mm,
But when it comes to me, Neil, the person, the one lesson that I've learned is that I haven't made enough time for the process of transition. For Neil,
mm, mm,
I just jump in and get into action, which does help me, but it's not ideal. So it's that fine line between being stuck but making time to process the actual transition. And why it's important and why I find for myself in hindsight it is important is because I become aware of resistance a little too late sometimes. you're in a position, you're in the transition, or you're potentially through the transition, and then you find that, hey, but there's still something niggling here at the back. And that's that resistance, and that's as a result of not making time for the actual process of transition.
Are you talking about resistance in yourself
In
and
myself,
in
I'm talking about
yourself? Yeah.
within myself. Yeah. So it's that space between clarity and doubt, because my personality is, let's get this done, but without having processed the resistance that might be there, it does lead to a little bit of doubt, and it can lead, and it has led in some instances, to lack of motivation. So I think if there's a lesson for me is make time for processing the transition. Don't be attached to a particular outcome, and be curious about your own needs, your own personality, your own drivers, your own triggers, and how does that show up in that organization or whatever transition you're going through. Because I have found that as time went on, I've become much more relational in my leadership style, focusing on people and bringing them along, as opposed to being transactional. We're all here to do a job. What's your problem kind of mentality. And so making time for that process is something that I can really, really work on and have worked on, yeah. But it
Thank
all
you.
stems back to, Crispin, sorry, just a quick one. It all comes back to that clearly defined for yourself, for myself, what type of leader do I want to become? And the type of leader I want to become is somebody that inspires people to be their best, to achieve their dreams. It doesn't matter how big or small. And how do I influence that process through leadership and also just being part of a team?
Thank you for that, Neil, and it talks nicely to what Anisha has in the chat box around triggers and the imposter syndrome and that. Thank you for those posts. Neil, in the few minutes we have left, if you look into the future, and it's a daunting future, I think, for many people. It's an unsure future. It's very, very disruptive. I don't think there's clarity at all in terms of what it'll look like a year from now, 5 months from now, even. And I think that accelerated pace of change and accelerated pace of uncertainty, and back to what Elmarie was calling the messiness of where we find ourselves. I want to circle back to what you said about the kind of leader you want to be, the inspirational leader you are aspiring to, the leader that has influence. How do we bring that to a world that is as confusing and as disruptive and as uncertain as it is at the moment? How do we bring hope? How do we bring a sense of purpose and clarity and connection? And how do we use our influence? Or how do you see you using your influence as a leader in that space? And if there was one word of advice that you would give us as leaders that are facing this very daunting future, what would that be?
Yeah, Crispin, I think for me is actually, if I can call it, I'm using the word as I'm speaking. I'm coining the phrase as I'm speaking. It's conscious leadership. In other words, be conscious of the fact that we're living in a disruptive world, that there's a lot of uncertainty, both in terms of macro and micro environmental factors. And then marry that with what is my compass? What is my anchor? What do I want to be? And that's in all organizations. As I said, it doesn't matter. It could be in a personal relationship, it could be in the family, and in a workplace as well. And then consciously work towards identifying potential transition, needs for transition or change, and then working through that in a systematic way. So recognizing that the transition is at hand or will happen or is about to happen, and then doing the inner work to show up in the manner that you would like to show up. I think for me, what is critically important is to, as the Greek saying goes, know thyself. Because in the absence of knowing yourself, I have found that you get torn into so many directions, and it causes a lack of peace, or as we would say to each other, dis-ease, hyphenated. And it's not ideal to be operating as a leader or manager or even as a team member in a space of dis-ease. So it's really having clarity. And I found that the moment, this was about 15 years ago, when I got complete clarity on who do I want to become as a leader? What type of leader do I want to be? How do I want to show up? It makes transitions and decision making so much easier. It doesn't make it easy, makes it easier, because you have an anchor, you have a compass that drives you. If we always say to each other, you don't hang around where you're not valued. And so if you know your values and you know what you want, and you know that this particular client isn't for you, we just walk away. I mean, we've done that. I've done that many times. When the client and what they expect of you doesn't match both your own personal and also your organization's values. And I think that's quite important, Crispin, to have that courage to say, you know what, okay, thank you for the opportunity, but maybe not this time.
I like that. What was that? Don't hang around where you're not valued.
Well, the word is not hang around, maybe engage. Yeah. We don't want to be where there's a clash of values.
Neil, thank you. It's been really encouraging hearing your story. It's been encouraging to hear your own truthfulness around the importance of your own identity and knowing where you are as you're navigating through transitions. And thank you for the rich learning in that. And I guess that's what we're trying to do at Boundless Wisdom, is create opportunities for people to engage with us and spend time with us, also to have conversations like this and conversations about their own transition and the importance of identity and value and purpose and clarity of identity, I guess, is what you're also saying in the particular way. Thank you, Neil. As we wrap up, and before I open the floor for any comments or conversations, any last final thoughts from you, Neil, in terms of the topic and where we are and where we find ourselves, and anything else you may have on your heart that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think as a final comment from my side, the reality is that change and transition is part of our lives. It's inescapable, whether it be biological from when we're growing up to in the workplace where we're finding a completely disruptive and almost chaotic environment in which we operate. It's important to have, firstly, an anchor, a compass. And then secondly, to consciously deal with the transitions and not let it happen to you. And it's easier said than done, because in a world of high pressure, I tend to get very task orientated, and then post facto, you sit back and you think, but why am I still uneasy about something? You know? And so I think just to make time to reflect and be conscious and to manage the process, because we as leaders, we have a responsibility to manage the process of transition for the teams in which we work. It's not only about us, but we cannot show up if we haven't done that within ourselves. If we don't have clarity about it, if we just continuously be busy and we don't make time, like I didn't make time, or I don't make enough time. So I think that's, for me, is very important, especially in the disruptive world in which we live. There's a
Super.
big need for us as leaders to just reflect, be completely clear on who am I, what do I want to achieve, what is my purpose, and how do I show up as an influential individual.
Thank you, Neil. Appreciate. Folks, if there are any questions or comments, you're welcome to use the chat. You're welcome to unmute. We'll still be around for another couple of minutes if you need to drop off by now this time. Thank you for joining us. Neil, before we close, our next Leaders in Conversation will be sometime in July. Just want to share that with us, please, and the topic.
Okay, so at the end of July, we'll be hosting a webinar again, and the topic will be around AI. The reality is it's here, we cannot get away from it, and my own resistance to it has surfaced, and so we need to discuss that and engage with the topic. And then we'll follow that up with, okay, so what does that mean for humanity? But that we'll do in August. But at the end of July, we're going to have quite an exciting discussion around AI and the implications thereof, both in terms of in terms of work, the world of work.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. Neil, there's a question from Emmanuel. Do you have a specific niche industry that you're most preferred to in your area of work and influence?
Yes. Okay. So the area that I quite enjoy is retail, Emmanuel. Thanks for that question. And I think retail is one of those industries that are on the cusp of always innovating, always bringing on new product lines, and the decision-making processes are so much faster than in other industries. So I quite enjoy retail and FMGC. But the kind of work that I've been doing over the last 2 decades or more really transcends across industries. It really speaks to building new target operating models for organizations, obviously management and leadership development. And that is across the entire value chain, from CRM right through to supplier management. Super. Even finance function effectiveness, yeah.
Cool. And public sector too now, as you mentioned earlier.
That's cool.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, comments while we have Neil on the line? Anything that Neil said that resonated with you that you'd like to explore further?
I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to
Anisha.
be here. Neil, I really enjoyed your calm presence. You know, it takes great inner work to get to this level of calm and composedness. And so I could really listen to you indefinitely. I do have to leave and fetch my son, but I'm really grateful to hear, and it's refreshing that the concept around conscious leadership is, you know, the most critical aspect that we need to focus on, because the part that you said, know thyself, it's also know thyself, heal thyself, and to better lead ourselves and others. Wow. So I want to acknowledge you because it's evident just in the way that you show up in your composure, that there's such a beautiful presence and self-awareness. And it's great to have connected with everyone here today. And Crispin, I was writing a thing to you. I also love your questioning and your framing and summarizing. It really kept the conversation insightful and engaging.